We are awaiting President Biden to take the stage for a rally in Raleigh, North Carolina. He's expected to speak in about 30 minutes. Now, why the campaign would plan a rally in the noon hour, the night after a late-night Waffle House visit and debate, is a great question, and we'll dive into it. But first to this, Biden's disastrous debate performance has ignited calls for him to get out of the race. And we are now getting breaking news reports about whether Biden will be forced to bow out or if the Democratic Party will still back him. Hello, everyone. This is Outnumbered. I'm Kayleigh McEnany on this Friday. Also joining me, host of the Kennedy Saves the World podcast, Kennedy, Fox News contributor and president of American Spirit Enterprises, Tammy Bruce, Fox News contributor and former State Department spokesperson under President Obama, Marie Harf, and Fox News contributor and former Utah Congressman, Jason Chaffetz. We are getting new reaction to whether or not President Biden will stay in the race after a shocking and frankly quite hard performance to watch last night that ignited widespread panic across Democrats. Within 30 seconds of Biden appearing on stage, he bizarrely appeared to address a non-existent audience. And as he slowly made his way to the podium, some folks began to sense something just wasn't right.
Folks, how are you? They'd raised $500 million, billion dollars, I should say, in a 10-year period. We'd be able to wipe out his debt. We'd be able to help make sure that all those things we need to do, child care, elder care, making sure that we continue to strengthen our health care system, making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID, with dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare, we're providing housing for Black Americans. The impact on the choice that Black families have to make relative to child care, the idea that they're going to, I've been proposing that everybody, the millionaires pay 1%. 1%. So no one I would not raise the cost of Social Security for anybody. I got my handicap, which when I was vice president, down to a 6. He wants to get rid of the ability of Medicare for us to be able to negotiate drug prices with the big pharma companies. What I'm going to do is fix the tax system. For example, we have 1,000 trillionaires in America. Billionaires in America. No one was hurt. No one Israeli was accidentally killed, and it just stopped. I'm going to continue to move until we get the total ban on the total initiative relative to what we're going to do with more border patrol and more asylum officers.
Tough to watch, and he talks to world leaders. Keep that in mind. Those 90 minutes on stage set Biden's re-election bid into total crisis.
It was a really disappointing debate performance from Joe Biden. His biggest issue that he had to prove to the American people was that he had the energy, he had the stamina, and he didn't do that.
There was one Democratic congressman I was in touch with who was on Capitol Hill at a watch party with a number of other lawmakers. This member's own reaction was that he wanted to jump off of a bridge.
He had one thing he had to accomplish, and that was reassure America that he was up to the job at his age. And he failed at that tonight. And, you have to ask, how did we get here?
They're having conversations about what they should do about it. Some of those conversations include, should we go to the White House and ask the president to step aside? Other of the conversations are about, should prominent Democrats go public with that call? Because they feel this debate was so terrible.
I don't think we should sugarcoat this. I have heard it from members of Congress. I have heard it from people who have worked many Democratic campaigns, who are working in interest groups, people along those lines. What do we do now? Yeah. Can he still be replaced?
You're going to hear discussions that I don't know will lead to anything, but there are going to be discussion about whether he should continue.
I think the conversations range from whether he should be in this race tomorrow morning to what was wrong with him.
The people who were texting with me were very concerned about President Biden seeming extremely feeble, seeming extremely weak. Joe Biden's job was to reassure them tonight. His job was to calm his party, to make them feel that, yes, I can do this. I have 4 more years in me. I have the ability and the stamina and the strength to do 4 more years. He did not do that. He did the opposite of that.
I think there's a lot of people who are going to want to see him consider taking a different course now.
Ouch. You know, First Lady Jill Biden said she was not watching television before the debate. Let's hope they weren't watching after, because that is not what a sitting president running for re-election wants to hear. And now there appears to be total chaos at the White House. Listen to this. BBC reporter Katty Kay posted that she's hearing from the White House that conversations are happening that put all options on the table. But White House officials tell CNN that Biden has no plans to drop out.
There are no plans, I'm told, for the president to drop out of the race. And even further, I'm told that the president is still committed to a second debate in September, which is currently scheduled for September 10th and hosted by ABC News, much along the lines of the rules of the debate that was hosted last night. Now, the advisor that I spoke with said that they're not putting too much stock in the conversation last night, and that many of the staffers on the campaign and in the White House also worked on President Obama's re-election in 2012, and they tried to draw the parallel to that first debate that was a very low performance for President Obama. Even he would call it a stinker. And they said if you had believed the pundits in the wake of that debate, Mitt Romney would have been president after that.
Tammy, if that's true, that's not Fox's reporting, but it is CNN's, that he's doubling down on a second debate, which is stunning. And reading behind the tea leaves as someone who's run a White House press shop, this is a White House in chaos. You have probably official White House sources telling CNN we're in this, and some White House person going rogue telling Katty Kay all options are on the table?
Yes, Katty Kay, some people might not know her, but very liberal, well-respected, longtime BBC host. So you've got individuals who have those relationships, which would have to be longtime relationships. You've got op-eds in the New York Times saying he's got to go. People on cable television, people who are so loyal normally to him and the Democrats that they push the Russia hoax theory at the expense of their own reputations, perhaps their own futures, and they did it. What this tells you is that there's a disconnect completely with the Biden administration and the campaign, that they had no idea what to expect last night, that everyone was shocked enough, and the fact that they're saying this publicly indicates that they can't get it into the White House privately. So there is a break in the conversation completely. That tells you how much chaos there really is.
And also what's happening on the Hill. Annie Carney, well-respected New York Times reporter, said that she overheard someone say they never knew James Clyburn could run that fast. Now, Chad Pergram was able to track him down and asked him quite a few questions, and he said, stay the course. I'm paraphrasing him there. Annie Carney also said that Nancy Pelosi was moving quite fast before she actually got a comment. Our own Chad Pergram said this, and I talked to him on the phone. So he has a source that says both Pelosi and Jeffries have reserved comment on Biden. Jeffries wants to wait until after the rally today. I would note Hakeem Jeffries did say on camera that it was actually off camera. I stand behind that ticket. But the point is there's muddled messaging. There's congressmen running around. No one is in charge. You've been there, Jason. It seems like a party in chaos.
It is a party in chaos because their leader, their vaulted one, is performing the way. For a lot of people, if you don't watch Fox News, this is breaking news. You haven't heard this story. Yeah. If you watch this network, guess what? You've seen the daily drumbeat of this incompetency. And remember, every one of those Democrats in the House, they're on the ballot with Joe Biden. If Joe Biden voters don't show up, they don't get there. But there's a lot of chatter right now. Should he be the nominee? Should he drop out? But I'm telling you, I started something with the Heritage Foundation with which I work with, the Oversight Project. And about 4 months ago, we started doing a state-by-state analysis. Guess what, folks? You can't just simply drop off the ballot. Democrats don't have an automatic slot in every state that they can just swap out the names. That's not the way this works.
Yeah, it's not the way it works. Although, you know, some say it'd be easy to put him in at the convention if he steps aside. But to your point, there are state rules that
in a lot of states, you have to die in order to be taken off the ballot.
Interesting. Marie, you know, I do want to ask you some insider questions. Hello, but you are a Democrat on the couch, so I have to get your reaction to last night.
Well, first I should say I was on a plane back from Israel overnight watching this with 13 Democratic political operatives. And we were all kind of watching it on the Wi-Fi on our phones. And you could see us start to look at each other and think, okay, we were nervous, but this isn't what we thought was going to happen. I mean, look, Biden had a bad night. He had a bad night. We can say it. Democrats can say it. I would associate myself with a lot of the comments that my Democratic colleagues said on other networks. I think that, look, Joe Biden has good days and bad days on the stump. He had a great State of the Union. That wasn't that long ago. But he is older, as is Donald Trump. So I think today what Democrats are thinking are a few things. Number one, if there was any talk about him bowing out, and Jason brings up some very good sort of messy legal questions, which are a different issue, we have a lot of young people who want to be president, and there is some downside to a messy process. You know, right? Sorry, go ahead.
No. I do want to ask you. So Tara Palmieri said one Democrat told her it would have to be a combination of Schumer, Pelosi, Bill Clinton, Obama, telling him to stand down. Politico Playbook says it would have to be broader. It'd have to be family members like Valerie Biden. Who do you think it would have to be?
I think there's one person, and it's Joe Biden.
Wow.
I think there's no one else. I think she helped encourage him to run. And look, Democrats think he had a bad night, but they also think that he is a very good man, has been a very good president, beat Donald Trump once. And while he had a bad night, Democrats will still be pushing today that Donald Trump is a bad man. And he was a bad president, and he did not win that debate. He said a ton of things that were untrue. He said a ton of crazy things parroting Putin's talking points. So I would say Joe Biden lost the debate. I wouldn't say Donald Trump won. And today, what I am most interested in, Kayleigh, is the polling we get out of this. Because a lot of people have actually baked in Biden's age. They've seen Fox. They've seen the RNC tweets. A lot of people have baked in this caricature that he's feeble. I will be curious how much this actually changes those independent votes. I'm not sure it'll be a huge change.
Kennedy, in less than 20 minutes, Biden is expected to take a stage in North Carolina. I'm not sure why you're doing this in North Carolina where you're behind 7 points. I don't know why you're doing it in the noon hour after you had a candidate up until nearly midnight.
I mean, imagine the amount of force it would take to change the conversation from the one that Democrats are having right now. You know, not just people in conservative media, but these are his most loyal supporters. And they're the ones who are saying enough is enough. It's time to close this chapter. They're asking themselves on CNN, how did we get here? Because you kicked the can down the road. You know, from when he ran in 2020, you were warned that this is the natural evolution of someone's brain when they are cognitively impaired. And they have run out of road, unfortunately. It's actually really hard to watch this. It's hard to watch someone when words escape them. And if this is someone you've looked up to, Thomas Friedman wrote in the New York Times, he was weeping watching this because he loves Joe Biden, but they have to be honest with themselves. And unfortunately, there's been a lot of dishonesty here. And I agree, the one person to blame for this, the one person who deserves the blame, is Jill Biden. I wrote about that today in the Daily Mail.
Yeah, I do not know how 16 people, intelligent people, sat with him for 8 days and said, let's go, this is a good idea. Some would call that political malpractice.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kayleigh McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.